Victorian England, 1880. The rain fell in unforgiving sheets over the rolling hills of Hampshire, as if the heavens themselves mourned the passing of Lord Richard Harrington. The funeral procession wound its way through the muddy country road, a sombre line of black carriages that seemed to disappear into the mist. Inside the lead carriage, Alexander Westmoreland, the Duke of Blackmore, sat in stoic silence, his sharp features hardened by grief, yet betraying no emotion. At 39, the years had been kind to his appearance, but merciless to his soul. Widowed 7 years prior, he had retreated into the rigid structure of duty and propriety, earning him a reputation throughout London society as a man of impeccable honour and impenetrable coldness. Across from him sat Lady Eleanor Harrington, her delicate hands clutching a sodden handkerchief. At 21, she was a vision of quiet dignity despite her overwhelming grief. Her chestnut curls were tucked beneath a black bonnet, and her pale face was partially obscured by a veil of mourning. She had not spoken a word since they departed the cemetery. "We shall arrive at Harrington Hall shortly," Alexander said, breaking the heavy silence. "I've arranged for your belongings to be packed. You'll depart for Blackmore Manor tomorrow." Eleanor's eyes flickered up to meet his. "So soon?" Her voice was barely audible above the drumming of rain against the carriage roof. "Your father's solicitor was quite clear. As your appointed guardian, I am to oversee your introduction to society until a suitable marriage is arranged." "I am 21, Your Grace. Surely I am capable of managing my own affairs." Alexander's jaw tightened. Your father thought otherwise. He recalled the moment vividly, standing at Richard's bedside just days ago, clasping his friend's frail hand as the life ebbed from him. "Promise me, Alexander," Richard had wheezed. "Promise me you'll protect her. She has no one else." "I swear it," Alexander had replied. "I'll guard her as my own daughter." Now, looking at the young woman before him, Alexander felt the weight of that promise settle uncomfortably upon his shoulders. Eleanor was no longer the gangly child who had once hidden behind her father at society gatherings. She had blossomed into a woman of quiet grace and thoughtful demeanour. "I remember you from my father's hunting parties," Eleanor said suddenly, studying him with intelligent eyes. "You never smiled then either." A lesser man might have been offended, but Alexander merely raised an eyebrow. "I find little occasion for frivolity." "Is that what smiling is to you, frivolity?" "In times of mourning, certainly." Eleanor looked away, her profile sharp against the rain-streaked window. "My father smiled often, even in his final days." Alexander felt something twist in his chest. A pang of envy, perhaps, for his friend's ability to find joy even in darkness. Lord Harrington was a remarkable man. "And yet you are nothing like him," Eleanor observed. "No," Alexander agreed. "I am not." The carriage slowed as it approached the sweeping drive of Harrington Hall. The grand manor house, with its Tudor facade and sprawling gardens, had always seemed full of light and warmth when Richard was alive. Now it loomed like a mausoleum against the grey sky. Alexander descended first, extending his hand to assist Eleanor. As her gloved fingers touched his, he felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. She stepped down, her mourning dress brushing against him, and for a brief moment he caught the scent of lavender and old books, a combination that was uniquely hers. He withdrew his hand perhaps too quickly, disconcerted by his reaction. "Lady Fairchild will accompany you to Blackmore tomorrow," he said, referring to his widowed aunt who served as his hostess. "The journey is not arduous, but you shall stop at Huntington for the night." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on her childhood home. "And what of Harrington Hall?" "It will be maintained until your marriage, at which time it shall pass to your husband's stewardship." A shadow crossed her face. "So I am to lose my father and my home in one stroke." "You will find Blackmore has an excellent library," he offered, recalling her fondness for literature. "Your father mentioned your scholarly pursuits." For the first time that day, a flicker of interest animated her features. "Did he?" "Indeed. He spoke of your translations of Greek poetry with considerable pride." A faint blush coloured her cheeks. "He exaggerated my modest abilities." Richard Harrington was not given to exaggeration. They had reached the entrance, where the household staff stood in a line of mourning black. The butler, Simmons, bowed deeply. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor, the solicitor awaits in the study." "Thank you, Simmons." Eleanor turned to Alexander. "Will you join us for the reading?" Alexander hesitated. His duty was to ensure her well-being, but the business of wills and inheritances seemed a private affair. "If you wish it." "I do," she said simply, and he was struck by the quiet determination in her voice. The study was warm, a fire crackling in the grate against the damp chill of the day. Mr. Finch, the family solicitor, rose as they entered, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "Lady Eleanor, Your Grace, shall we proceed?" The reading was straightforward. Eleanor inherited her father's personal fortune, a considerable sum that would be held in trust until her marriage. The estate would pass to her future husband, but with strict provisions ensuring it would eventually go to her children. "There is one more item," Mr. Finch said, extracting a sealed letter from his briefcase. "For His Grace, the Duke of Blackmore. Lord Harrington instructed me to deliver it privately." Eleanor glanced at Alexander curiously as he accepted the letter, but she asked no questions. Later, alone in the guest chamber assigned to him, Alexander broke the seal on Richard's letter with steady hands. The familiar handwriting brought a fresh wave of grief. "Alexander, by the time you read these words, I will have departed this world, leaving you with the burden of my most precious treasure. I know your sense of duty will compel you to honor your promise, but I ask that you do more than merely guard Eleanor's virtue and prospects. She is a remarkable creature, my friend, brilliant and spirited in ways that society often seeks to diminish in young women. Do not let her light be extinguished by the constraints of propriety. She deserves more than a convenient match with some titled buffoon. I remember how you were before Catherine's passing, a man who found joy in poetry and debate, who laughed without reservation. Perhaps in guiding Eleanor, you might rediscover some part of yourself that has been lost." With deepest gratitude and friendship, Richard Alexander folded the letter carefully, his throat tight with emotion. Outside, the rain had ceased, and a sliver of moonlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the floor. He crossed to the window, gazing out at the silvery landscape. In the garden below, a solitary figure walked among the rose bushes. Eleanor, her black dress a stark contrast against the wet greenery. She moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to touch a bloom or leaf. As he watched her, a strange disquiet settled over him. He had promised to protect her as a father would, yet the sight of her bathed in moonlight stirred something in him that was decidedly not paternal. Alexander turned sharply from the window, troubled by his reaction. "Merely grief and exhaustion," he muttered to himself, though he knew it for a lie. Tomorrow, they would journey to Blackmore Manor, where he would fulfill his duty as her guardian from a proper and respectful distance. He would find her a suitable husband, see her settled, and then return to his solitary existence. It was the honorable course. Yet, as he prepared for bed, Richard's letter seemed to mock him from the writing desk. "Perhaps in guiding Eleanor, you might rediscover some part of yourself that has been lost." Alexander extinguished the lamp, but sleep eluded him. Instead, his mind filled with images of intelligent eyes and chestnut curls bathed in moonlight, images that would soon become the first of many dreams that would haunt his nights. The journey to Blackmore Manor took the better part of 2 days, with Lady Fairchild providing a buffer of propriety between Alexander and his new ward. Augusta Fairchild was a woman of 65 years, sharp-witted and observant, despite her advancing age. She had served as Alexander's hostess since the death of his wife, Catherine, and was one of the few people who dared to speak frankly with him. As their carriage rolled through the imposing iron gates of Blackmore, Eleanor leaned forward to catch her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The manor rose from the mist like a Gothic dream, all stone battlements and soaring towers, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches seemed to reach for the grey sky. "It's like something from a novel," she murmured, unable to hide her fascination. Lady Fairchild chuckled. "Mrs. Radcliffe would certainly approve, though I assure you we harbour no mysterious monks or hidden passages." "That you know of, Aunt," Alexander replied with unexpected dryness, earning a surprised glance from Eleanor. "The Duke possesses a sense of humour after all," Lady Fairchild stage whispered to Eleanor, "though he guards it like a state secret." The carriage stopped before the grand entrance, where a line of servants awaited. Alexander helped first his aunt, and then Eleanor descend. As Eleanor's feet touched the gravel drive, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the manor's facade and casting her face in golden light. Alexander found himself momentarily transfixed by the sight. "Your Grace?" Eleanor's voice pulled him from his reverie. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. "May I present Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper, and Hargreaves, the butler? They will see to your needs." Mrs. Porter stepped forward, a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes. "Welcome to Blackmoor, Lady Eleanor. Your chambers have been prepared in the east wing, with a lovely view of the rose garden." "Thank you," Eleanor replied warmly. "I look forward to exploring the grounds." "And the library," added Lady Fairchild, with a knowing smile. "Alexander has mentioned your scholarly interests." Eleanor's gaze flickered to the Duke. "His Grace is most attentive." "When duty requires it," Alexander responded, discomfited by her scrutiny. "Mrs. Porter will show you to your rooms. I have business to attend to, but we shall dine at 7. With a bow, he retreated to his study, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where he could collect his thoughts. He had not expected the girl to unsettle him so. Perhaps it was merely the strangeness of having a young woman in his home after so many years of solitude. At dinner that evening, Eleanor appeared in a gown of deep blue that, while still observing mourning conventions, brought out the remarkable colour of her eyes. Alexander found himself watching her as she conversed easily with Lady Fairchild about the various families in the county. "And the Pennington sisters?" Eleanor inquired. "My father mentioned they were quite the force in local society." "Oh, indeed," Lady Fairchild replied. "Miss Beatrice Pennington has set her cap for every eligible bachelor in 3 counties, including our Alexander here." Alexander nearly choked on his wine. "Aunt Augusta, you exaggerate." "Do I? She practically swooned into your arms at the midwinter ball." Eleanor's lips curved in amusement. "And did his Grace catch her?" "Reluctantly," Lady Fairchild confided. Then promptly handed her off to her mother with some excuse about an urgent message. "A diplomatic retreat," Alexander said dryly. "A cowardly one," his aunt retorted. "Though I can hardly blame you. The woman has the intellectual depth of a puddle." Eleanor laughed, a bright musical sound that seemed to transform the cavernous dining room. Alexander found himself staring at the elegant line of her throat, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. "Are there no ladies who meet with your approval, Your Grace?" she asked. "None who warrant the sacrifice of my independence," he replied, then immediately regretted his words. As her guardian, he should be advocating the virtues of matrimony, not dismissing it. "Yet you were married once," Eleanor observed quietly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. "Forgive me," she added quickly. "That was impertinent." "It was honest," Alexander replied, surprising himself. "Yes, I was married. Catherine was exceptional. They were devoted to each other," Lady Fairchild said softly. "Her passing changed everything." Eleanor's eyes held a depth of understanding that belied her years. Some losses reshape us entirely. Alexander felt exposed under her gaze, as if she could see through the carefully constructed walls of his reserve. He changed the subject abruptly, inquiring about her preferences for breakfast, but the moment lingered in his mind long after the meal had ended. Later that night, unable to sleep, Alexander found himself drawn to the library. A light glowed beneath the door. Someone else was apparently suffering from insomnia. He hesitated, then pushed the door open. Eleanor stood by one of the tall windows, a volume of poetry in her hands. She had exchanged her dinner gown for a simple robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. The moonlight streaming through the window transformed her into a luminous apparition. She turned at the sound of the door but showed no surprise at his presence. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor, I apologize for the intrusion." "It's your library," she pointed out. "I'm the intruder." Alexander crossed to the fireplace, maintaining a proper distance. "What are you reading?" She held up the book. "Keats. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. Not in lone splendour hung aloft the night," he continued from memory, surprising them both. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "You know Keats. I was not always the stern guardian you see before you," he admitted. "There was a time when poetry was as essential to me as breathing." What changed? The question hung between them, deceptively simple, yet profoundly complex. Alexander found himself answering honestly, driven by some impulse he could not name. When Catherine died, words seemed insufficient. "Empty." Eleanor nodded, her expression contemplative. "After my mother passed, my father could not bear music for nearly a year. She played the pianoforte, you see. And now? Now he would hum her favorite melodies when he thought no one was listening. Her voice caught. He would have wanted me to remember that joy returns eventually. Alexander felt an unfamiliar urge to comfort her, to cross the distance between them and take her hand. Instead, he remained rooted in place, bound by propriety and his own rigid self-discipline. "Your father was wise in many ways," he said. "You should retire, Lady Eleanor. Tomorrow will be a full day." She looked as if she might say more, but then merely nodded, replacing the book on its shelf. As she passed him, the scent of lavender enveloped him once more. "Good night, Your Grace. Good night, Lady Eleanor." Long after she had gone, Alexander remained in the library, staring at the shelf where she had returned the Keats volume. Finally, he drew it out, opening to the poem she had been reading. The familiar words stirred something long dormant within him, a hunger for beauty, for connection. Disturbed by the direction of his thoughts, he snapped the book shut and returned to his chambers. But that night, for the first time in years, Alexander dreamed, not of his deceased wife, but of chestnut curls illuminated by moonlight and eyes that seemed to see into his very soul. He woke with a start before dawn, his heart racing with a confusing mixture of desire and guilt. The oath he had sworn to Richard Harrington echoed in his mind. He had promised to protect Eleanor as a father would protect a daughter. These dreams, these unsettling feelings, were a betrayal of that sacred trust. "This cannot continue," he muttered to the darkness. From this moment forward, he would maintain a proper distance from his ward. He would fulfill his duty with honor, regardless of what it might cost him personally. But as the first light of dawn crept across his room, Alexander knew with dreadful certainty that the battle within him had only just begun. The London season was in full bloom, a whirlwind of balls, soirees, and garden parties, where the elite of society paraded their wealth and their marriageable offspring with equal pride. After 3 months at Blackmore, Eleanor had been launched into this glittering chaos under the careful supervision of Lady Fairchild and the distant but watchful eye of her guardian. Alexander had been true to his resolution, maintaining a careful formality in all his interactions with Eleanor. He attended the necessary social functions as her guardian, scowled appropriately at overeager suitors, and retreated to the sanctuary of his townhouse study whenever possible. If he sometimes found himself watching her from across crowded ballrooms, captivated by her graceful movements or the animation that transformed her face when engaged in spirited conversation, he kept such observations strictly to himself. Tonight's event was the Countess of Hartfield's annual midsummer ball, reputedly the social highlight of the season. Alexander stood at the perimeter of the ballroom, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, as he observed Eleanor dancing with Lord Edmund Rutherford, the youngest son of the Duke of Kenilworth. "She moves beautifully, does she not?" Lady Fairchild appeared at his side, her shrewd eyes taking in his expression, "like a water nymph among river stones." "An unusual metaphor, Aunt," Alexander replied, careful to keep his tone neutral. "But apt. Most of these young ladies flounce about like decorated geese, but Lady Eleanor possesses a natural grace." Alexander could hardly disagree. Where other debutantes simpered and fluttered, Eleanor moved with quiet confidence, her intelligence evident in her thoughtful expressions and measured responses. She had quickly become a favorite among the more discerning members of society, though her scholarly interests and forthright manner sometimes bewildered the more conventional hostesses. "Lord Rutherford seems quite taken with her," Lady Fairchild observed. Indeed, the young lord was gazing down at Eleanor with unmistakable admiration. At 27, he was considered one of the season's most eligible bachelors, handsome, wealthy, and possessed of an amiable disposition. "He would be a suitable match," Alexander said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Lady Fairchild gave him a sidelong glance. "Would he? I find him rather bland, like a pudding without spice." "Not all marriages require spice, Aunt. Compatibility and mutual respect are more enduring foundations," says the man who once rode 15 miles in a thunderstorm to bring his wife wildflowers because she mentioned missing the ones that grew near her childhood home. Alexander stiffened. "That was a different time. And you were a different man," she replied softly. "One I sometimes miss, nephew." Before he could respond, the dance ended, and Eleanor was approaching them, her cheeks flushed and eyes bright with exertion. "Your Grace, Lady Fairchild," she greeted them with a small curtsy. "What a magnificent affair!" "You seem to be enjoying yourself," Lady Fairchild said with a smile. "Lord Rutherford is quite the dancer." "He is very proficient," Eleanor agreed diplomatically. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "But not to your taste." "I did not say that," she replied, though her expression suggested otherwise. "He was most attentive." "And most eager for the next dance, I'd wager," Lady Fairchild added, "along with half the gentlemen in the room." As if on cue, a young viscount approached, requesting Eleanor's hand for the upcoming quadrille. With a polite smile, she accepted, leaving Alexander and his aunt once more. "She has collected 4 bouquets, 2 poems of dubious quality, and a rather ambitious proposal to tour the Crystal Palace," Lady Fairchild reported. "Not bad for her first season." "And what does she think of these suitors?" Alexander found himself asking. "She finds Lord Pemberton too frivolous, Sir William too serious, and the rest barely worth mentioning." Lady Fairchild's eyes twinkled. Though she did say that Lord Rutherford reminded her of a character from a particularly tedious novel. Despite himself, Alexander felt a flicker of amusement. She has a discerning eye. Indeed, much like her guardian. The evening progressed, and Alexander dutifully played his role, engaging in conversation with various society matrons and observing Eleanor from a distance. It was well past midnight when he noticed her slipping through the French doors onto the terrace, apparently seeking a moment's respite from the crush inside. After a brief internal debate, he followed, telling himself it was merely to ensure her safety. The terrace was dimly lit by paper lanterns, the summer air heavy with the scent of roses from the garden below. Eleanor stood at the balustrade, her face upturned to the star-strewn sky. "Are you unwell, Lady Eleanor?" he asked, keeping his voice formal. She turned, startled by his presence. "Your Grace, no, I am quite well. I merely needed a moment of quiet. The season can be overwhelming." "It's not the activity I find taxing," she admitted. "It's the artifice, so much careful posturing and strategic conversation with so little genuine exchange." Alexander moved to stand beside her, maintaining a proper distance. "Society functions by certain rules." "Does it function well, though?" she challenged. "All these elaborate rituals to pair young women with suitable men based on wealth and status rather than character or compatibility." "How you sound like a radical," he said, though without censure. Eleanor laughed softly. "Perhaps I am. My father indulged my unconventional thinking. He believed women deserved more than to be decorative possessions." Richard always was ahead of his time. They fell silent, the distant music from the ballroom creating a strange, dreamlike atmosphere around them. "Lord Rutherford intends to call tomorrow," Alexander said finally. "He will likely seek my permission to court you formally." Eleanor's expression remained carefully neutral. "And will you grant it?" "He is well regarded from an excellent family and possesses sufficient fortune to maintain you in comfort." Alexander paused. "Unless you object." "What would you do if I did object?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "Would you respect my wishes, or would duty compel you to promote the match regardless?" The question caught him off guard. "Your happiness is not irrelevant to me, Lady Eleanor." "But is it paramount?" The directness of her gaze unsettled him. In the soft lantern light she looked ethereal, yet there was nothing insubstantial about the challenge in her eyes. "What qualities would you seek in a husband?" he asked instead of answering. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Intelligence, certainly, a love of literature, the courage to question convention when necessary." She paused. "And passion, not merely the physical kind, but a capacity for deep feeling. For caring about something beyond oneself. A rare combination." "Yes," she agreed, her eyes never leaving his. "Very rare." Alexander felt a dangerous heat building between them, an unspoken current that threatened to sweep away all his careful restraint. He took a deliberate step back. "It grows late. You should return inside before your absence is remarked upon." For a moment, he thought she might argue, but then she nodded. "Of course, Your Grace." Always proper, always correct. There was a note in her voice he could not quite interpret, disappointment perhaps or resignation. Before he could analyze it further, she had slipped past him and back into the ballroom, leaving only the lingering scent of lavender in her wake. Alexander remained on the terrace, his hands gripping the stone balustrade as he struggled to master his turbulent emotions. The oath he had sworn to Richard weighed heavily upon him, a constant reminder of his duty. Yet with each passing day, that duty became more difficult to fulfill with honor. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alexander," came Lady Fairchild's voice from behind him. He didn't turn. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" She moved to stand beside him. "I've watched you watching her. I've seen how you hold yourself apart, rigid as a statue, whenever she enters a room. She is my ward." "Yes, and therein lies the problem." Lady Fairchild sighed. "The heart doesn't always recognize the barriers we try to place before it." "I have no romantic interest in Lady Eleanor," he said firmly, the lie bitter on his tongue. His aunt regarded him skeptically. "Then you won't mind when Lord Rutherford or one of these other pups claims her hand? When she becomes another man's wife?" The mere thought sent a bolt of something dark and possessive through him, and he knew his expression betrayed him. "I thought as much," Lady Fairchild said softly. "Alexander, you've spent 7 years in self-imposed exile from life. Perhaps it's time to consider what Richard truly wanted for both his daughter and his friend. He wanted me to protect her. Yes, but not at the expense of her happiness, or yours." Alexander shook his head. "It's impossible." "Why? Because of your promise? Because of society's expectations? Or because you're afraid?" He had no answer for her, and after a moment, she patted his arm gently. "Think on it, nephew. But don't wait too long. Even duty has its limits." She left him alone with his thoughts and the distant strains of a waltz. Above, the stars glittered coldly, indifferent to the turmoil within his breast. Eleanor would dance with other men tonight, smile at their compliments, perhaps even encourage their suits. It was the natural order of things, the very outcome he had promised Richard he would facilitate. So why did the thought fill him with such unbearable anguish? The following afternoon, as predicted, Lord Rutherford called at the Duke's London residence, requesting a private audience. Alexander received him in his study, a sombre room that reflected its owner's temperament. "Your Grace," the young lord began nervously, "I come with a matter of great importance." "I believe I can guess the nature of your visit, Lord Rutherford," Alexander replied, gesturing for him to be seated. "You wish to discuss Lady Eleanor?" "Yes, sir." Rutherford straightened his shoulders. "I seek your permission to pay court to her. My intentions are honorable, I assure you." Alexander regarded him coolly. "Lady Eleanor is not merely a ward, but the daughter of my dearest friend. Her happiness and well-being are of paramount concern to me. Of course, Your Grace, I would strive to make her happy in all things." "Would you?" Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Lord Rutherford, what do you know of Lady Eleanor's interests, her passions?" Rutherford shifted uncomfortably. "She is most accomplished, I believe. Plays the pianoforte beautifully." "She does not play at all," Alexander corrected him, "though she translates Greek poetry and has a particular fondness for the natural sciences." "Indeed?" Rutherford looked genuinely surprised. "How unusual." Something in the young man's tone hardened Alexander's resolve. "Lady Eleanor is unusual in many respects, Lord Rutherford. She requires a husband who will appreciate her uniqueness, not seek to conform her to society's expectations. I assure you, Your Grace, I hold Lady Eleanor in the highest esteem." "Esteem is not sufficient," Alexander said firmly. "She deserves a man who values her mind as much as her beauty, who will encourage her intellectual pursuits rather than stifle them." Rutherford's expression suggested that he found this concept somewhat bewildering. "I would never prevent Lady Eleanor from reading, if that is her pleasure." "How magnanimous," Alexander replied dryly. The rest of the interview proceeded with painful civility, concluding with Alexander's reluctant permission for Rutherford to call upon Eleanor, though with no formal understanding. As he showed the young lord out, Alexander was acutely aware that he had judged the man against an impossible standard. His own feelings for Eleanor, which grew deeper and more complex with each passing day. Later that afternoon, he found Eleanor in the library of his London house, deeply engrossed in a volume of natural philosophy. "Lord Rutherford called today," he announced without preamble. Eleanor looked up, marking her place carefully before closing the book. "Did he?" "He requested permission to court you." Her expression revealed nothing. "And your response?" "I granted it, conditionally." Alexander moved restlessly about the room, unable to meet her eyes. "You are free to receive his attentions, but there is no formal understanding." "How generous of you," she said, her tone faintly ironic. Alexander stopped his pacing. "You do not seem particularly enthused by the prospect. Should I be?" Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to replace the book on its shelf. "Lord Rutherford is pleasant enough, I suppose, but I find little to engage with beyond his surface charm. He is considered quite a catch." "By whom? The mothers who wish to see their daughters advantageously settled? The young ladies who measure a man's worth by his title and fortune?" She turned to face him. "I thought you knew me better than that, Your Grace." "What I know," Alexander said carefully, "is that as your guardian I am obligated to consider suitable matches for you." Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes searching his. "And is that all you are? My guardian?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with dangerous possibility. Alexander felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "What else would I be?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "Sometimes when you look at me, I think, but then you withdraw, retreat behind your walls of duty and propriety." Alexander's heart hammered in his chest. "Eleanor, you called me by my given name," she noted, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That's the first time." He hadn't even realized the slip. "It was inappropriate. I apologize." "Must everything between us be governed by rules and constraints?" She took another step toward him, close enough now that he could see the flecks of amber in her blue eyes. "My father trusted you above all others, not because you were bound by duty, but because you were capable of great feeling beneath that reserved exterior. Your father did not anticipate—" Alexander stopped, unable to complete the thought. "Anticipate what?" Eleanor pressed. "This," he said finally, gesturing vaguely between them, "this complication. Is that what I am to you? A complication? You know that is not what I meant." Eleanor's gaze was steady, challenging. "Then what did you mean, Alexander?" The sound of his name on her lips broke something loose within him. Before he could reconsider, he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face. "You are everything," he whispered. "Everything I should not want, everything I cannot have, and everything I cannot stop thinking about." Her eyes widened, and for a terrible moment, he thought he had misread her entirely. Then her hands came up to cover his. "Why can you not have me?" she asked simply. "I swore to your father that I would protect you, guide you as a father would a daughter." "But I am not your daughter," Eleanor said firmly, "and what I feel for you is decidedly not filial." The admission sent a jolt of heat through him. "Eleanor, you don't know what you're saying." "I know precisely what I'm saying." Her voice was steady despite the blush spreading across her cheeks. "I have known my own mind since I was 16. I do not speak without careful consideration." Alexander knew he should step away, restore the proper distance between them. Instead, he found himself tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbone with his thumb. "There is an 18-year difference between us," he said, searching for reasons to resist the magnetic pull drawing them together. "And yet you understand me better than men my own age ever could," she countered. "You see me, not as an ornament or a prize, but as I truly am. Society would not approve. When has society's approval ever mattered to either of us?" Alexander closed his eyes briefly, fighting for control. "Your father trusted me." "My father wanted my happiness above all else," Eleanor said softly. "As did yours for you, I imagine." The reminder of his own father, who had married for duty rather than love, and lived to regret it bitterly, struck Alexander deeply. He had sworn never to make the same mistake, yet here he was denying what had grown between them in the name of obligation. "This cannot happen," he said, though he made no move to release her. "Not now." Eleanor's eyes searched his. "But someday?" It was a promise he had no right to make, yet he could not bring himself to extinguish the hope in her gaze. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I need time to think, to consider what is best for both of us." Reluctantly, he let his hands fall away from her face. Eleanor stepped back, disappointment evident in her expression, though she maintained her dignity. "Very well, Your Grace," she said formally. "I shall receive Lord Rutherford when he calls." The return to formality stung, But Alexander knew it was necessary. "Thank you for your understanding." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Understanding is not the same as agreement, Alexander. Remember that." With that, she left the library, her posture straight and proud despite the tension that lingered between them. Alexander remained motionless, the ghost of her touch still warming his skin. That night, his dreams were more vivid than ever, Eleanor in his arms, her lips pressed to his, her body yielding against him. He woke in a cold sweat, tangled in his bedsheets, guilt and desire warring within him. The following weeks became an exquisite torture. True to her word, Eleanor received Lord Rutherford's attentions with perfect politeness, though Alexander noted she never encouraged him beyond what propriety demanded. She maintained a careful distance from Alexander himself, addressing him with formal correctness in company, but avoiding situations where they might be alone together. Lady Fairchild observed this delicate dance with increasing concern, finally confronting her nephew one evening after Eleanor had retired early, pleading a headache. "This cannot continue, Alexander," she said bluntly. "You're both miserable." "It will pass," he replied, though without conviction. "Will it? Or are you simply hoping that time will dull what you feel for her, that eventually she'll resign herself to marrying someone she doesn't love?" Alexander rubbed his temples wearily. "What would you have me do, Aunt? Break my word to her father? Scandalize society? Subject her to whispers and judgment? I would have you be honest, with yourself and with her." Lady Fairchild's voice softened. "Alexander, I knew Richard Harrington for 30 years. He valued honor, yes, but he valued happiness more. Do you truly believe he would condemn you for loving his daughter?" "Love," Alexander repeated, the word both terrifying and liberating. "Is that what this is?" "You tell me," his aunt challenged. Before he could answer, they were interrupted by a commotion in the entry hall. Moments later, the butler appeared, his normally impassive face betraying concern. "Your Grace, a messenger has arrived from Lady Eleanor's maid. It seems her ladyship has left the house." Alexander was on his feet instantly. "Left? Where? When?" "Shortly after retiring to her room, sir. She left a note for her maid saying not to worry, but the girl became concerned and came to me." "Did the note say where she was going?" Lady Fairchild asked. "No, madam. Only that she needed air and would return shortly." Alexander checked his pocket watch. It had been over an hour since Eleanor had excused herself. A cold dread settled in his stomach. "Have the carriage brought around immediately?" "Where will you look?" Lady Fairchild asked, as Alexander strode toward the door. He paused, thinking. "The park, perhaps. She mentioned enjoying the night air there." "Be careful, nephew. London after dark is no place for a young woman alone, or for a duke, for that matter." Alexander barely heard her, his mind consumed with images of Eleanor wandering the dangerous streets of nighttime London. He grabbed his coat and hat, striding out into the misty evening. The park was deserted save for a few suspicious figures who melted away at the approach of his carriage. No sign of Eleanor. Alexander's anxiety mounted as he directed his driver to circle the neighboring streets, peering into the gloom for any glimpse of her. Finally, a flash of movement caught his eye, a solitary female figure standing on Westminster Bridge, gazing down at the dark waters of the Thames. Even from a distance he recognized the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself. "Stop here," he commanded, leaping from the carriage before it had fully halted. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Eleanor," she turned, her face pale in the dim gaslight. "Alexander." Relief flooded him, quickly followed by anger. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here alone? Do you have any idea of the danger?" "I needed to think," she said simply. "To breathe." "You couldn't think in the safety of your chambers." "The walls felt like they were closing in around me." Eleanor turned back to the river. "Everyone making decisions about my future, planning my life as if I were a chess piece to be moved across the board." Alexander's anger faded, replaced by understanding. "I know the feeling." "Do you? Then why perpetuate it?" She looked at him directly now, challenging him. "Why push me toward a man I could never love?" "Because it is expected," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Expected by whom? Society? My father?" Eleanor shook her head. "My father wanted me to marry for love, Alexander. He told me so many times. He and my mother were a love match against both families' wishes. They never regretted it, not for a single day. Alexander moved to stand beside her at the bridge's railing, close but not touching. It would not be easy. The age difference alone would raise eyebrows. Since when has the Duke of Blackmore concerned himself with raised eyebrows? Despite everything, Alexander found himself smiling. You have a point. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the mist curl over the river. Then, tentatively, Eleanor's hand moved to cover his on the railing. I'm not asking for promises or declarations, she said softly. Only that you consider what might be possible between us, without the weight of artificial obligations. Alexander turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. And Lord Rutherford? I have already informed him that while I value his friendship, I cannot encourage his suit. When? This afternoon. It was difficult but necessary. Alexander felt a rush of admiration for her courage. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Harrington. She smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. I hope to do so for many years to come. The implication hung between them, full of promise. Alexander knew that nothing was resolved, that challenges and obstacles remained. But standing there in the misty darkness, Eleanor's hand warm in his, he allowed himself to imagine a future he had previously denied. We should return, he said reluctantly. Lady Fairchild will be beside herself with worry. Eleanor nodded. Will you tell her about this? I believe she already knows, Alexander admitted. She sees more than she lets on. Together they walked back to the waiting carriage, a new understanding between them. The journey home was quiet but comfortable, their hands occasionally brushing in the darkness. Each touch a silent affirmation of feelings too new and fragile to be fully articulated. As they neared the house, however, reality intruded once more. Alexander knew that whatever path they chose would not be easy or straightforward. Society had expectations, conventions that could not simply be ignored without consequence. We must proceed carefully, he said, as the carriage slowed. For your sake as much as anything. Your reputation is of less concern to me than my happiness, Eleanor interrupted. But I understand the need for discretion. Alexander helped her from the carriage, allowing his hands to linger on hers a moment longer than strictly proper. We will speak more tomorrow, when both of us have had time to reflect. Eleanor's eyes, luminous in the lamplight, met his. My feelings will not change overnight, Alexander. Nor will mine, he admitted. But this is too important to rush. She smiled, understanding in her gaze. Until tomorrow, then. As Alexander watched her ascend the steps to his townhouse, a strange lightness filled him. Hope, he realized, a sensation almost forgotten in the years since Catherine's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with Eleanor at his side, if she would have him. But first he had a letter to write, to his solicitor, requesting a review of the guardianship arrangements. If they were to pursue this connection between them, it must be done honorably, with no shadow of impropriety. Helena deserved nothing less. The London gossip mill operated with ruthless efficiency, grinding the smallest indiscretions into grist for scandalous speculation. By mid-July, whispers about the Duke of Blackmore and his beautiful ward had begun to circulate through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs alike. Did you see how he watches her? They say he's refused 3 perfectly respectable offers for her hand. My cousin's wife's sister overheard them in the library at the Havenshires ball, speaking most improperly. The rumours were, for once, not entirely unfounded. Though Alexander and Eleanor had maintained perfect propriety in public, something had shifted between them. A current of understanding that manifested in shared glances, brief touches, and conversations that seemed innocuous to outsiders, but were laden with meaning for them alone. Lady Fairchild observed these developments with cautious approval, acting as both chaperone and conspirator in their careful dance around society's expectations. She arranged outings where Alexander and Eleanor might have moments of privacy within the bounds of propriety, and deflected curious inquiries with practiced skill. It was during one such outing, an afternoon at the Royal Botanical Gardens, that Alexander found himself alone with Eleanor in the orchid conservatory, Lady Fairchild having conveniently lingered behind to admire a particularly rare specimen. Your aunt is not subtle, Eleanor remarked, amusement lighting her features. Alexander smiled. Subtlety has never been among her virtues. They walked slowly among the exotic blooms, the humid air heavy with sweet fragrance. Eleanor paused to admire a particularly striking purple orchid, her profile etched against the verdant background like a cameo. "I received a letter from my father's solicitor this morning," she said casually. "Apparently, there has been some inquiry regarding the terms of my guardianship." Alexander nodded. "I asked him to review the arrangements." "May I ask why?" "Because if we are to explore what exists between us, I want to ensure everything is done properly. Your father entrusted me with your welfare. I will not betray that trust." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "And what did Mr. Finch discover?" "That the guardianship was specifically designed to end upon your marriage or your 22nd birthday, whichever came first." Alexander met her gaze steadily. "You will be 22 in 3 months." 3 months, she repeated thoughtfully. "Not so very long to wait." "No," Alexander agreed, "though it feels an eternity." Eleanor's lips curved in a small smile. "I've waited this long to find a man worth loving. I suppose I can wait a bit longer for propriety's sake." The simple declaration, "a man worth loving," sent a surge of emotion through Alexander. Before he could respond, they heard Lady Fairchild's voice approaching, accompanied by another less welcome sound. "Lady Eleanor! What a delightful surprise!" Eleanor stiffened almost imperceptibly at the shrill greeting. "Miss Pennington," she acknowledged with a polite nod. Beatrice Pennington swept into the conservatory in a flurry of pink silk and excessive ornamentation, her mother and Lady Fairchild following in her wake. At 28, Miss Pennington had been on the marriage mart for nearly a decade, her increasingly desperate pursuit of a titled husband becoming something of a society joke. "Your Grace," she simpered, dropping into a curtsy so deep it threatened to topple her precariously arranged coiffure. "How fortunate to encounter you here among the plants." "Indeed," Alexander replied dryly. "Lady Fairchild, I see you've encountered Mrs. Pennington and her daughter." "Quite unavoidable, I'm afraid," his aunt muttered under her breath before saying more loudly, "Mrs. Pennington was just sharing the most fascinating gossip about Lord Rutherford's sudden departure for the continent." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lord Rutherford has left London?" "Oh yes," Beatrice said eagerly. "Quite abruptly. They say he was nursing a broken heart after being rejected by a certain lady." Her pointed glance at Eleanor left little doubt about whom she meant. "How unfortunate for him," Alexander said coolly, "though I'm sure the change of scenery will prove beneficial." Mrs. Pennington, a stout woman with shrewd eyes, studied the interaction with interest. "It does seem that eligible gentlemen are being turned away with alarming frequency this season. One wonders what Lady Eleanor is waiting for." "Perhaps she simply has standards that few can meet," Lady Fairchild suggested. "Or perhaps," Mrs. Pennington said, her gaze sliding meaningfully between Eleanor and Alexander, "her affections are already engaged elsewhere." A tense silence followed this thinly veiled insinuation. Alexander felt a surge of protective anger, but before he could speak, Eleanor stepped forward, her expression serene despite the heightened color in her cheeks. "How perceptive you are, Mrs. Pennington," she said calmly. "Indeed, I find that my interests lie in directions that might surprise conventional thinkers. The translation of ancient Greek poetry, for instance, and the study of botanical science." She gestured to the orchids surrounding them. "Did you know that these remarkable plants have developed specialized relationships with specific pollinators over thousands of years? Nature's way of ensuring perfect compatibility." The subtle rebuke in her words was not lost on Mrs. Pennington, whose lips thinned in displeasure. "How educational. Come, Beatrice, we mustn't keep Lady Eleanor from her studies." With a flurry of insincere farewells, the Penningtons departed, leaving an awkward silence in their wake. "Well," Lady Fairchild said finally, "that was about as subtle as a cavalry charge." "They will talk," Alexander said grimly. "It's already begun." Eleanor met his troubled gaze steadily. "Let them. In 3 months, I will be free to make my own choices, regardless of society's opinion." "It's not so simple," he argued. "Reputation once lost is not easily restored." "I'm not suggesting we announce our intentions from the rooftops," Eleanor said reasonably, "but neither will I pretend to consider suitors I have no interest in, simply to deflect speculation." Lady Fairchild nodded approvingly. "Well said, my dear. Now shall we continue our tour of the gardens? I believe the rose collection is particularly fine this time of year. As they moved through the conservatory toward the exit, Alexander offered his arm to Eleanor, a gesture both proper and intimate. She took it with a small smile, her touch sending warmth through him, despite the troubled thoughts that lingered in his mind. The Penningtons' insinuations were only the beginning, he knew. Once the gossips had a scent of potential scandal, they would pursue it relentlessly. He had weathered society's disapproval before and could do so again, but Eleanor, young, unmarried, with her future before her, was more vulnerable. Yet as he felt the reassuring pressure of her hand on his arm, Alexander found his resolve strengthening. Whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. The path forward might not be easy, but it was increasingly clear that it was the only path either of them wished to take. The following weeks brought a mixed blessing. As the season wound down and the heat of summer drove many families to their country estates, the intensity of the gossip diminished somewhat. However, this respite was balanced by new challenges as Alexander found himself navigating the complex transition from guardian to suitor. They had agreed to maintain proper appearances until Eleanor's birthday in October, while privately acknowledging the deepening bond between them. This delicate balance demanded constant vigilance, especially as they prepared to leave London for Blackmore Manor. "The country will afford us more privacy," Lady Fairchild observed, as their trunks were being loaded onto the carriages. "Fewer prying eyes." "But sharper ears," Alexander cautioned. "Servants' talk." Eleanor, descending the townhouse steps in a travelling dress of deep green, smiled at his concern. "Then we shall give them little to talk about, beyond a guardian's proper care for his ward, and her growing friendship with his rather unconventional aunt." Lady Fairchild chuckled. "Unconventional. I prefer discerning." The journey to Hampshire passed pleasantly, with Lady Fairchild dozing intermittently, and Alexander and Eleanor discussing everything from poetry to politics. It was during these unguarded conversations that Alexander felt most keenly the rightness of their connection. The easy flow of ideas, the shared laughter, the comfortable silences that required no filling. By the time they reached Blackmore Manor, twilight was settling over the estate, bathing the ancient stone in golden light. Eleanor gazed up at the imposing structure with what looked remarkably like affection. "It feels like coming home," she said softly. Alexander helped her from the carriage, allowing his hand to linger on hers a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad." That evening, after a quiet dinner, Alexander retreated to his study to attend to correspondence that had accumulated during their absence. He was deep in concentration when a soft knock at the door disturbed his thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting his valet or perhaps Lady Fairchild. Instead, Eleanor appeared, a leather-bound volume in her hands. She had changed from her dinner gown to a simpler dress of deep blue, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, hovering uncertainly at the threshold. "Lady Fairchild has retired with a headache, and I found myself restless." Alexander rose immediately. "You're always welcome here." She entered, glancing around the study with interest. Unlike the formal, impersonal space in London, his country study reflected more of his true nature. Walls lined with well-worn books, comfortable furniture arranged for reading rather than impression, and personal mementos displayed without ostentation. "I've never been in here before," she observed, trailing her fingers along the spines of his books. "Few people have," Alexander admitted. "It's something of a sanctuary." Eleanor smiled, understanding in her eyes. "Then I'm honored by the admission." She moved to a small table where several framed miniatures were displayed, his parents in their youth, his younger brother who had died in childhood, and Catherine, her delicate features captured by a skilled hand. "She was beautiful," Eleanor said quietly, studying the portrait of his late wife. "Yes," Alexander agreed, moving to stand beside her. Inside and out, Eleanor turned to face him, her expression earnest. "Tell me about her, if it's not too painful." The request surprised him, but Alexander found he wanted to share this part of himself with her. "We met at a musicale when I was 20. She was playing Beethoven. Badly, she would insist, though I thought it perfect." A smile touched his lips at the memory. She had no artifice, no guile. She laughed easily and loved deeply. "You were happy together?" "Very." Alexander's eyes met Eleanor's. "We had 5 years before the illness took her." Too brief, but I would not trade those years for a lifetime of lesser connection. Eleanor's hand found his, her fingers twining with his. Thank you for telling me. You're not troubled by my past. Why would I be? Your capacity to love deeply, to commit yourself fully, these are qualities I admire, not faults to be overlooked. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. Catherine helped shape the man you are. I could never resent that. Alexander felt something shift within him at her words, a loosening of a knot that had bound him since Catherine's death, not a diminishment of what they had shared, but an acceptance that his heart had room for new love, different but equally profound. He raised their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You continue to astonish me, Eleanor Harrington. A blush stained her cheeks, but she did not look away. Good. I should hate to become predictable. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotion. Then, reluctantly, Eleanor withdrew her hand. I should retire, she said. Tomorrow promises to be a long day. Alexander nodded, though everything in him rebelled against her departure. Until tomorrow, then. She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. I almost forgot. I brought you something. She returned to place the book she'd been carrying on his desk. I found it in the library at Harrington Hall before we left London. My father always said it was your favorite. Alexander looked down at the volume, a rare first edition of Wordsworth's poems that he and Richard had once spent an entire weekend hunting through bookshops to find. I thought it was lost, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not lost, Eleanor replied softly, just waiting to be found again. With that, she slipped from the room, leaving Alexander with the precious book and a heart too full for words. The following days settled into a pleasant rhythm. Mornings found Eleanor in the library or gardens, often accompanied by Lady Fairchild, while Alexander attended to estate matters. Afternoons frequently included walks or rides through the extensive grounds, and evenings were spent in shared pursuits, reading aloud, chess matches, or music in the drawing room. To an outside observer, it would have appeared a perfectly ordinary household. A young lady completing her education under the supervision of her guardian and his aunt. But beneath this placid surface ran currents of deepening affection and growing anticipation as Eleanor's birthday drew nearer. It was during one of their afternoon rides, nearly a month after their return to Blackmoor, that the careful balance they had maintained was unexpectedly tested. They had ventured farther than usual, exploring the wooded boundaries of the estate. Lady Fairchild, claiming a twinge of rheumatism, had remained behind, extracting a promise that they would behave with perfect propriety in her absence, a promise delivered with a knowing twinkle in her eye. The day was gloriously fine, the September air crisp with hints of the autumn to come. Eleanor rode with easy grace, her dark riding habit setting off the flush of exercise in her cheeks. Alexander found himself watching her more than the path, captivated by the joy she took, in the simple pleasure of a brisk gallop across open country. They had paused to rest the horses beside a small stream when the weather changed, with the suddenness typical of English countryside. Dark clouds rolled in, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. We should return, Alexander said, eyeing the rapidly darkening sky. Eleanor nodded, but as they mounted and turned back toward Blackmoor, the rain intensified, driven by a rising wind. Within minutes, they were thoroughly drenched. There's a gamekeeper's cottage ahead, Alexander called over the downpour. We can shelter there until this passes. The cottage was small but sturdy, maintained for the use of estate staff during hunts or when tending the more distant parts of the property. Alexander ushered Eleanor inside, then quickly saw to the horses, securing them in the small lean-to at the back. When he returned, dripping, to the main room, he found Eleanor had discovered a supply of dry firewood and was attempting to light the small hearth. "Allow me," he said, moving to take the flint from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and despite the chill of the rain, heat flared between them. Eleanor stepped back, watching as he skillfully coaxed a flame from the tinder and built it into a proper fire. The cottage was sparsely furnished. A rough table with 2 chairs, a small cupboard containing basic supplies, and a narrow cot against one wall, presumably for the gamekeeper's use during overnight stays. "You should move closer to the fire," Alexander suggested, noticing Eleanor's shiver. "Your habit is soaked through." Indeed, the heavy wool riding dress clung to her, in a way that proper society would find scandalous, outlining the slender curves of her figure. Alexander averted his gaze, struggling to maintain the decorum they had so carefully preserved. "Your coat isn't faring much better," Eleanor observed, removing her sodden gloves and holding her hands toward the growing flames. Alexander shrugged out of the dripping garment, hanging it near the fire to dry. His shirt, though damp, had been somewhat protected, but he was acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation, alone, rain-soaked, in a remote cottage with night approaching. "The storm seems to be settling in," he said, peering out the small window at the lashing rain. "We may be here for some time." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Are you concerned about my reputation or your own resolve?" The directness of her question startled a laugh from him. "Both, perhaps." She smiled, the firelight casting a golden glow over her features. "We've maintained perfect propriety for weeks now. Surely we can manage a few more hours." "Hours that may extend into the evening," Alexander pointed out. "If we don't return by nightfall, there will be talk. Lady Fairchild will understand the delay. It's not my aunt I'm worried about." Eleanor sighed, removing her riding hat and attempting to tame her damp curls. "Always society, always appearances. Don't you ever tire of it?" "Constantly," he admitted, "but I would not have your name tarnished, especially when we're so close to resolving matters properly." She moved toward him, close enough that he could see droplets of rain still clinging to her eyelashes. 6 weeks, she said softly. 6 weeks until my birthday, and then we need no longer pretend." The temptation to reach for her was almost overwhelming. Alexander took a deliberate step back, maintaining the distance that propriety and his own precarious control demanded. 6 weeks, he agreed. Not so very long. But standing there in the intimate confines of the cottage, with rain drumming on the roof, and Eleanor looking at him with undisguised affection, it felt like an eternity. They passed the next hour in careful conversation, scrupulously avoiding topics that might inflame the tension simmering between them. Eleanor discovered a deck of cards in the cupboard, and they engaged in several hands of whist, the mundane activity providing a welcome distraction. As dusk approached, Alexander became increasingly concerned about their situation. "The rain shows no sign of abating. I think we must reconcile ourselves to spending the night here." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "Lady Fairchild will be beside herself with worry. She knows I would keep you safe," Alexander assured her. "And when we fail to return, she'll send searchers. But in this weather, with darkness falling, they're unlikely to find us before morning." Eleanor nodded, accepting the reality of their predicament with characteristic pragmatism. "Then we must make the best of it." Alexander busied himself checking the cottage's supplies, relieved to find dried meat, bread, and even a small flask of brandy. "Not the dinner you're accustomed to, I'm afraid." "I'm hardly fragile," Eleanor replied, accepting the simple fare with good grace. They ate in companionable silence, the fire casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor. Outside, the storm continued unabated, wind howling around the eaves and rain lashing against the windows. When they had finished their makeshift meal, the inevitable question of sleeping arrangements could no longer be avoided. "You must take the cot," Alexander said firmly. "I'll manage well enough on the floor near the fire." Eleanor looked at the narrow bed dubiously. "It hardly seems fair. You'll be dreadfully uncomfortable." "I've slept in worse conditions during hunting expeditions," he assured her. She acquiesced, though reluctantly. As the evening wore on and the fire burned low, the temperature in the cottage began to drop. Alexander added more wood to the hearth, but noticed Eleanor trying to suppress a shiver. "Your clothes are still damp," he observed with concern. "As are yours," she countered. Alexander considered their options, limited as they were. "There are blankets in the cupboard. You should remove your outer garments and wrap yourself in them. I'll step outside while you do so." "In this downpour, don't be absurd." Eleanor rose decisively. "Turn your back if propriety demands it, but don't catch your death on my account." Alexander obeyed, fixing his gaze on the wall as he heard the rustle of fabric behind him. The awareness that Eleanor was removing her riding habit sent his pulse racing, despite his best efforts to maintain composure. "You may turn around now," she said after a few minutes. He did so cautiously, finding her seated on the edge of the cot, wrapped in a rough woolen blanket. Her riding habit and boots were arranged near the fire to dry, though he noted with relief that she still wore her shift and stays beneath the blanket. "Your turn," she said, politely averting her eyes. Alexander removed his damp waistcoat and boots, but retained his shirt and trousers, unwilling to test the limits of their restraint further. He settled on the floor near the hearth, using his rolled-up coat as a pillow and draping another blanket over himself. For a time, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Alexander thought Eleanor had drifted off to sleep when her voice came softly through the darkness. "Alexander? Yes? When did you first know that your feelings for me had changed from guardianship to something else?" The question hung in the air between them, intimate and searching. Alexander considered his answer carefully. "There was no single moment," he said finally. "Rather a gradual awakening. I would find myself watching you as you read, captivated by your expressions, or I would anticipate our conversations, planning what topics might interest you." He paused. "But if I had to identify a turning point, it was perhaps that night in the library at Blackmore when you quoted Keats from memory. You stood in the moonlight, and suddenly I saw not my ward, but a woman of remarkable mind and spirit." "I remember that night," Eleanor said softly. "You recited the poem with me. It was the first time I glimpsed the man behind the stern guardian." "And you?" Alexander asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. "When did you first know that I was falling in love with you?" The word, love, spoken so openly between them for the first time, sent a jolt through him. "Yes," he managed. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I admired you from the beginning," she said thoughtfully. "Your integrity, your intellect. But I think it was during those weeks after my father's funeral, when I was still lost in grief. You never offered empty platitudes or treated me as fragile. You gave me space to mourn, but also purpose. Books to read, translations to attempt. You saw my strength when I couldn't see it myself." Alexander felt humbled by her words. "I only did what seemed right. That," she said simply, "is precisely why I love you." The declaration, delivered with such quiet certainty in the intimate darkness of the cottage, broke through Alexander's carefully maintained reserve. He rose from his place by the fire and crossed to kneel beside the cot, taking Eleanor's hand in his. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have tried to be honorable, to respect the trust your father placed in me, but I can no longer deny what I feel for you. I love you, not as a guardian, but as a man loves a woman he hopes to make his wife." In the flickering firelight, he saw tears shining in her eyes. "Alexander," she whispered. He pressed her hand to his lips. "I know the timing is not what we planned. I had thought to wait until your birthday to do everything properly, but I find I can no longer keep these words unspoken." "Then speak them," Eleanor urged, her free hand coming up to touch his cheek. "Here now, with only the storm as witness." "I love you," he said again, the words coming easier now. "Your brilliant mind, your courageous heart, your unwavering spirit. You have brought light back into my life when I thought darkness was all that remained for me." Eleanor's smile was radiant despite her tears. "And I love you, not as a girl with a romantic fancy, but as a woman who knows her own heart and mind. I choose you, Alexander Westmoreland, with clear eyes and full purpose." The sincerity in her gaze undid him. With a groan of surrender, Alexander leaned forward, capturing her lips in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened as years of loneliness and months of restraint gave way to the flood of emotion between them. Eleanor's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer as she responded with surprising passion. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she shifted to the edge of the cot, pressing against him with innocent eagerness. It was this very innocence that finally penetrated Alexander's haze of desire. With enormous effort, he broke the kiss, though he kept her in the circle of his arms. "We must stop," he said, his breathing uneven. Eleanor's eyes, dark with unfamiliar emotions, searched his. "Must we?" "Yes," he said firmly, though everything in him protested. "Not like this, Eleanor. Not in a gamekeeper's cottage during a storm, with your reputation at risk and our future uncertain." She sighed, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "Always the honorable man." "Not always," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her hair. "But in this, I must be. I respect you too much to act otherwise." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes as she drew back slightly. 6 more weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he agreed, and then, if you'll have me, a lifetime together. He retrieved the fallen blanket, wrapping it carefully around her shoulders before returning to his place by the fire. Though they were physically separated by the width of the small room, a new intimacy bound them together. Promises spoken and unspoken, a future now clearly envisioned rather than merely hoped for. As Eleanor drifted to sleep, lulled by the rain and the warmth of newfound certainty, Alexander remained awake, watching over her. Whatever challenges awaited them, society's judgment, the adjustment to their new relationship, the practical matters of marriage and estate, they would face them together. For the first time in 7 years, Alexander Westmoreland, Duke of Blackmore, allowed himself to look forward to the future with genuine hope. 3 months later, the drawing room at Blackmore Manor glowed with candlelight, the winter evening held at bay by blazing hearths and the warmth of celebration. A small gathering of trusted friends had assembled to witness the signing of the marriage contract between Alexander Westmoreland, Duke of Blackmore, and Lady Eleanor Harrington. "Are you certain about this, my dear?" Lady Fairchild asked, adjusting Eleanor's hair as they prepared to join the gathering. "A quiet wedding at Blackmore rather than a grand London affair. Many young ladies dream of a cathedral and hundreds of guests." Eleanor smiled, meeting her soon-to-be aunt's gaze in the mirror. "I'm certain. What matters is not the ceremony but the marriage that follows." Lady Fairchild patted her shoulder affectionately. "You always did have more sense than convention. Alexander is fortunate indeed." "As am I," Eleanor replied softly. Downstairs, Alexander awaited her arrival with barely concealed impatience. The past 3 months had been a careful navigation of society's expectations and their own deepening bond. After the night in the cottage, they had maintained proper appearances until Eleanor's birthday, when Alexander had formally relinquished his guardianship. 1 week later, to the surprise of no one who knew them well, he had proposed marriage. Society had buzzed with gossip, of course. Some questioned the propriety of a guardian marrying his ward so soon after her coming of age. Others raised eyebrows at the 18-year age difference. The more vicious whispers suggested improprieties during Eleanor's guardianship. But Alexander and Eleanor faced the speculation with united dignity, neither denying their feelings nor apologizing for them. They had decided on a winter wedding at Blackmore rather than waiting for the traditional June ceremony in London, partly to avoid the height of the gossip season, but mostly because neither wished to delay their future together. "Your Grace," Mr. Finch approached, legal documents in hand. "Everything is prepared for the signing." "Thank you," Alexander replied, his eyes drawn to the doorway where Eleanor now stood. She wore a gown of deep ivory silk, simple yet elegant, with Catherine's sapphires at her throat. A gift from Alexander that had brought tears to her eyes when he presented them the previous evening. "You look beautiful," he said quietly as she joined him. Eleanor's smile was radiant. "And you look happier than I've ever seen you." "I am," he admitted, offering his arm. "Shall we make this official?" The signing proceeded with formal dignity, witnessed by Lady Fairchild, Mr. Finch, and the local vicar who would perform the ceremony the following day. As Eleanor's signature joined his on the marriage contract, Alexander felt a profound sense of rightness, as if the disparate pieces of his life were finally falling into their proper places. Later, as their guests enjoyed refreshments, Alexander drew Eleanor aside into the library, the room where their journey toward each other had truly begun. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a small package from his desk drawer. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. "It's lovely," she said, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "But I don't understand." "Open it," Alexander encouraged. Inside she found pages filled with his precise handwriting, line after line of poetry. "These past months I found myself returning to verse," he explained. "Words that had once seemed empty suddenly felt necessary again. The only way to express what you've awakened in me." Eleanor's eyes glistened as she read the first poem, addressed simply to E. "Alexander," she whispered, deeply moved. "This is beautiful. You restored poetry to me," he said, taking her hands in his. "Just as you restored joy and purpose and hope. Tomorrow you will become my wife in the eyes of the world, but in my heart you have already transformed me." Eleanor rose on tiptoe, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. And you have transformed me, from a girl uncertain of her place to a woman confident in her choices and her future. A discreet knock interrupted them. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Hargreaves said from the doorway, "but Lady Fairchild asked me to remind you that propriety suggests the bride and groom should not be absent from their own celebration for too long." Alexander laughed, the sound free and unrestrained in a way that still surprised those who had known him during his years of grief. "Tell my aunt we shall return directly." As the butler withdrew, Alexander offered Eleanor his arm once more. "One more evening of propriety," he said with a smile that promised much more, "and then a lifetime of being truly ourselves together." Eleanor's answering smile held both innocence and anticipation. "I can think of no greater happiness." Together they returned to their guests, secure in the knowledge that what had begun in duty had transformed into something far more powerful. A love born of mutual respect and understanding, strong enough to weather society's judgment, and deep enough to heal wounds long thought permanent. And later that night, as snow began to fall gently over Blackmore Manor, Alexander stood at his study window, watching the grounds transform into a glittering wonderland. Tomorrow those same grounds would witness the beginning of his new life with Eleanor, not as guardian and ward, but as husband and wife, partners in all things. The moon broke through the clouds, casting silvery light across the snow-covered landscape. Alexander remembered Eleanor standing in just such moonlight the night he first realized his feelings had changed. How far they had come since then, through doubt and struggle, through society's constraints and their own fears, to this moment of perfect certainty. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" came Eleanor's voice from the doorway. Alexander turned, drinking in the sight of her. His future, his heart, his home. "I've been ready since the moment I admitted I loved you," he said simply. The rest was just waiting for the world to catch up. Eleanor crossed to join him at the window, fitting perfectly against his side as his arm encircled her shoulders. Together they watched the moonlit snow, the silence between them comfortable and expectant, the silence of two people who had found in each other not just love but understanding, not just passion but partnership. "Look," Eleanor said softly, pointing to where the clouds had parted completely, revealing a canopy of brilliant stars. "Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. Not in lone splendor hung aloft the night," Alexander continued, the familiar verses now imbued with new meaning. "And watching, with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite." As their voices blended in the quiet room, the final lines seemed a perfect promise for the journey ahead. "Still, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death." Tomorrow would bring vows and celebration, the official beginning of their life together. But in this moment, standing in the moonlight, poetry on their lips and love in their hearts, Alexander and Eleanor had already found their forever. The end. Dear listener, in this tale of Alexander and Eleanor, we find echoes of our own journeys through life's autumn and winter seasons. Like the Duke of Blackmore, many of us have known loss. We've weathered storms that seem to extinguish our inner light, leaving us in shadows of grief or solitude. Perhaps you too have built walls around your heart, convinced that your season for love and joy had passed. Yet Eleanor's gentle persistence reminds us that it's never too late for spring to return. Age is merely a number, while the capacity for deep connection transcends time itself. The 18 years between our characters mirror the wisdom and youth that can exist within each of us, regardless of the candles on our birthday cake. The most profound gift this story offers is permission. Permission to begin again, to rediscover parts of yourself long forgotten, to find new purpose when you thought your story's most meaningful chapters had already been written. Like Alexander rediscovering his love of poetry, there may be passions waiting to be rekindled in your own heart. Remember that the most beautiful relationships bloom from mutual respect and understanding. Eleanor valued Alexander not despite his years and experiences, but because of them. Similarly, your wisdom, your stories, your weathered heart, these are not burdens but treasures to be shared. As you rest tonight, know that second chances arrive in unexpected moments. Your life's story continues to unfold with possibilities for connection, for joy, for purpose. Tomorrow brings another page yet to be written, another opportunity to step from winter's shadow into the warming light of new beginnings. Sleep deeply, dream sweetly, and awaken with the Duke's newfound hope, the certainty that love, in its many forms, remains ever available to those brave enough to open their hearts once more. With deepest appreciation for sharing this journey. The Legends of the Fall Team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We hope this story of Alexander and Eleanor brought warmth, longing, and a spark of hope to your heart. If it did, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, sharing it with someone who loves romance, and commenting below. Your support helps us keep creating stories filled with love, redemption, and life-changing twists. And remember, at the end of this video, you'll see another suggested story from our channel. Click and be surprised by another emotional journey that may just steal your breath away. With affection, The Legends of the Fall Team.